When my husband David returned from his trip, I knew something inside him had already broken. I could see it in the way he stepped into the house slowly, as if each foot carried a different kind of pain. I was standing in the living room near the window, pretending to dust the same table I had already cleaned twice that morning. My hands were trembling and my eyes were swollen from crying. I had tried to hide the tears, but they leave marks that no powder or smile can cover. David looked at me for a long moment and said softly, "Maggie, what happened?" I couldn't answer. My throat burned with words that refused to come out. Then I heard laughter from the dining room. The sound felt like a knife twisting in the quiet air. It was our son, Ethan, laughing with his in-laws. They were sitting around the table, eating and talking like nothing in the world was wrong. That laughter was once the sweetest sound to me, but that day it sounded cruel. David turned his head toward it, and I saw his face tighten. He didn't shout. He didn't ask questions. He just stood there silently, his jaw clenched, his eyes cold. I whispered, "He found out, David. He found out everything." Ethan had discovered that David had transferred the business shares into his name before leaving on his trip. It was meant to be temporary, a way to protect the company during negotiations. But instead of waiting for his father to return, Ethan had gone to the board, claimed control, and told everyone that David was retiring. The betrayal had been fast, clean, and complete. David said quietly, "Where is he?" I pointed toward the dining room. He walked in slowly. The laughter stopped the moment he appeared. Ethan looked up with a faint smile and said, "Welcome home, Dad," as if nothing had happened. His wife Claire shifted uncomfortably beside him. David said thank you, but his tone was sharp like glass. I stood by the doorway watching as silence filled the space. Ethan said, "I was just telling them about the new project." David said, "Whose project?" Ethan hesitated. Then he said, "Ours." David's eyes flickered, but he said nothing. He turned and walked upstairs without another word. The room felt colder after he left. Ethan tried to continue his conversation, but even he knew the mood had changed. When the guests finally left, I went upstairs and found David sitting on the edge of our bed, his head in his hands. He said quietly, "I trusted him more than anyone." I said, "I know." He said, "When did he change, Maggie? When did he stop being my son?" I didn't know how to answer. I sat beside him and took his hand, but he pulled it away gently. He said, "Don't defend him. I'm not angry at him for wanting success. I'm angry that he couldn't wait for me to share it with him." That night David didn't sleep, and neither did. I lay awake listening to the creaks of the house, the faint sound of cars passing outside, and the echo of Ethan's laughter still ringing in my ears. I wanted to believe it was a mistake, a misunderstanding, that in the morning everything would make sense. But deep down I knew something had ended that night. The next morning I found David in the kitchen making coffee. He looked calm, too calm, the way people look when they are holding pain in their chest. He said, "I'm going to the office." I asked, "Are you sure you want to face him now?" He said, "I have to see what he has done." I watched him leave and felt a heavy emptiness settle inside me. When he returned hours later, he looked older by years. His face was pale and his eyes dull. He didn't speak for a long time. Finally, he said, "He's replaced everything, Maggie. Even the nameplate on my door." I said, "Maybe he didn't mean to." David laughed softly, but there was no humor in it. He said he meant every bit of it. He's not my son anymore. He's someone else now. That night, he sat in his study staring at old photographs. I stood by the doorway, afraid to interrupt. On his desk was a letter Ethan had written years ago when he was a boy. It said, "Thank you, Dad, for believing in me. I will make you proud." David touched the paper gently, like it was something fragile, and whispered, "I wish you still remembered this, Ethan." Watching him broke me in a way I can't describe. I wanted to cry, but my tears had already run dry. I promised myself then that no matter what happened, I would protect what was left of our family, even if it meant standing between the two people I loved most. I didn't know it then, but that promise would cost me more than I could ever imagine. The days after that were long and heavy, like the air before a storm. David moved around the house quietly, doing his work, speaking little, and keeping his emotions buried under calm politeness. Ethan came and went as he pleased. He dressed sharper, talked louder, and began to carry himself like a man who owned the world. I tried to keep peace between them, but every attempt felt like pouring water on stone. One morning, I came downstairs and found David already in the kitchen, staring out the window with a cup of coffee in his hand. The sun was shining outside, but his face looked shadowed. I said, "Are you going to the office again?" He nodded without looking at me. I wanted to stop him, to tell him to let go, but I knew he needed to see for himself. When he came back that evening, his silence told me everything. He walked past me without a word and went straight to his study. Later that night, he told me what he saw. His name was gone from the office door. His personal files had been replaced. Even the little model airplane Ethan had made for him when he was a child had disappeared from the shelf. He said quietly, "He's erased me, Maggie," like I was never there. I wanted to tell him it wasn't true, but I couldn't. The truth was sitting in his eyes. That night we ate dinner in silence. Ethan was out with his new investors, and the house felt empty. I stared at David's face under the soft light and realized how much older he looked. His shoulders were heavy with disappointment. I said, "Maybe he'll realize his mistake." David said, "Maybe, but by then it will be too late." The next morning, I heard him on the phone with Mark, his old business partner. His voice was calm, but I could hear the cracks underneath. When he hung up, he looked at me and said, "Mark still believes in honesty." I wish Ethan did too. I didn't reply. I just placed my hand on his shoulder. That afternoon, Ethan came home early with a folder in his hand. He said, "Dad, you should take some time off. You've worked hard your whole life. Let me handle the business from now on." The tone in his voice wasn't respectful. It was dismissive. David didn't argue. He just said, "All right, son. You do what you think is best." Ethan smiled, thinking he had won, and left. After he was gone, David turned to me and said, "Let him believe it. Sometimes the fall is harder when the climb feels too easy." I didn't understand then, but I soon would. A week later, David started writing notes in a small leather book. He didn't tell me what they were, but every night after dinner he locked himself in his study. I saw the tension in his shoulders lessen a little each day, as if writing was his way of releasing the pain. One evening I walked in quietly and saw what he was doing. He was documenting everything: transactions, deals, new names, and strange accounts. When he saw me, he didn't hide it. He just said, "Keep this between us." I nodded. I didn't ask questions. I trusted him. The next day, Ethan came home with Claire. She looked uncomfortable, her smile weak and her eyes downcast. While Ethan talked about his new project, she barely said a word. When he left the room, she whispered to me, "He's changing, Mrs. Carter." "He doesn't listen anymore?" I said softly, "I know." She looked at me with eyes full of fear. I wanted to tell her it would be all right, but I couldn't lie. Later that night, David sat beside me on the porch, watching the sky turn red with sunset. He said, "It's strange, isn't it, how silence can teach you more than words?" I said, "I don't want this to destroy our family." He looked at me and said, "It already has." After that, the nights felt colder. I would wake up and find David sitting alone in his study with a lamp glowing on his tired face. Sometimes I wanted to tell him to stop, to just walk away, but I knew he wasn't fighting for pride anymore. He was fighting for truth. One evening, Ethan came home late, his breath heavy with alcohol. He looked at his father and said, "You're old-fashioned, Dad. The world's moving on, and I'm leading it." David said nothing. Ethan left and went upstairs. When the door closed, David said quietly, "He'll understand one day that success built on betrayal never lasts." I sat beside him and whispered, "But when that day comes, it might be too late to fix what's broken." He looked at me, his eyes tired but steady, and said, "Then we'll fix it another way." I didn't know what he meant, but something in his voice told me he had already started a path that couldn't be reversed. The following weeks passed with a strange calmness that almost felt unreal. David spoke less and smiled even less, but there was something in his eyes, a quiet steadiness that replaced his earlier pain. I kept watching him from across the room, wondering what thoughts were moving behind that silence. Ethan had started spending most of his time outside. His car would pull up late at night, sometimes with music still playing inside, and I would see his silhouette in the headlights before he entered the house. He always looked tired, but pride hid it well. I knew that face. It was the same pride that once lived in David's eyes when he was building the company. But David's pride had come from struggle and sleepless nights, while Ethan's came from shortcuts and borrowed glory. One evening, I found David sitting by the fireplace. Papers were spread across the floor, some old files, some new contracts. He was studying them with quiet focus. I asked, "What are you doing?" He said, "Just cleaning up what's left of my name." I could hear the exhaustion in his voice. I sat beside him and asked, "Will it make any difference?" He smiled faintly and said, "Maybe not for the world, but for me it will." A few days later, the first storm hit. Ethan came home early, his face pale and his hands trembling. He said investors were backing out, the bank was holding payments, and a supplier had filed a claim against the company. He looked at David as if expecting him to fix it, but David stayed silent. I could see the conflict in Ethan's eyes: anger, fear, pride, and something close to regret. He said, "Dad, I need your help." David replied softly, "I thought you didn't need it anymore." Ethan's jaw tightened. He stormed out without another word. That night, I found David outside, sitting on the porch steps under the rain, his face wet not only from the water but from quiet tears. I went to him and said you could have helped him. He looked up at me and said, "No, Maggie, he needed to face this." The next morning I made coffee and watched the sunrise paint the sky gold. For a brief moment, everything looked peaceful again. But peace never lasts long when truth is buried deep. By the end of the week, things began to crumble faster. The news spread that Ethan's company was under investigation for financial irregularities. People who once called him a visionary now avoided his calls. Claire came over that evening, her eyes red from crying. She said, "I tried to warn him, Mrs. Carter. I told him to stop trusting the wrong people. He wouldn't listen." David stood behind me, silent, his face unreadable. After she left, I asked him, "Did you know this would happen?" He said, "I didn't make it happen, but I knew it would." You can't build something strong on a cracked foundation. A few days later, I went to the city with David. We passed the tall glass building that once carried his name. Now it bore Ethan's, but the new sign was already being taken down. Workers were removing the letters one by one, leaving marks on the wall like scars. David watched quietly. He didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He just said softly, "Sometimes life fixes things in its own way." On the way home, he asked me, "Do you remember when we first started?" I said yes. We had nothing but hope. He nodded and said, "Maybe that's what he needs now. To lose everything so he can find himself again." That evening, Ethan came home. His shoulders were slumped and the arrogance was gone. He sat at the table like a child who had finally seen how fragile power could be. I placed a plate of food before him, but he didn't touch it. He looked at his father and said, "I ruined everything, didn't I?" David didn't answer immediately. Then he said, "You lost something, yes, but not everything. You can still rebuild if you learn why it fell apart." Ethan looked at me, tears forming in his eyes. He said, "I thought I was making you proud." I said, "You did, until pride replaced love." He lowered his head, and I could see the boy I had raised beneath the man who had lost his way. That night, I sat alone by the window, watching the city lights shimmer in the distance. My heart ached for both of them, for the husband who had been betrayed and the son who had betrayed without realizing the cost. Forgiveness didn't come easily, but I could feel it growing quietly inside me, like a fragile flame. I knew that soon David would forgive him too, not because he had to, but because love is heavier than revenge. Days turned into weeks, and the house began to feel heavy with silence. Ethan tried to stay busy, but his eyes often wandered, searching for words he could not speak. David spent most of his time in the garden, trimming hedges, fixing the broken fence, and mending little things as if repairing the world outside could heal the one inside. I watched them both quietly. Sometimes I wanted to force them to talk, to sit at the same table and pour everything out, but some wounds need stillness before they can close. One morning I found Ethan sitting by the fireplace, his head in his hands, staring at the embers. He said softly, "Mom, I don't know where to start." I sat beside him and said, "Start by saying what you never said." He looked at me with eyes full of regret and whispered, "I am sorry. I thought I knew everything. I wanted to make Dad proud, but I hurt him instead. I placed my hand on his shoulder and said, "Your father knows that. He just doesn't know how to stop feeling the pain yet." That afternoon, David came in from the garden, wiping his hands on a towel. He looked at Ethan for a long moment and then said, "I kept waiting for you to say that." Ethan stood up slowly, his voice trembling. "I was ashamed, Dad. I didn't know how to face you." David sighed and said, "Shame is not the end, son. It's the beginning of understanding." They stood there, silent, facing each other as if the air between them carried all the years of distance and misunderstanding. Then David took a step forward and placed his hand on Ethan's shoulder. It wasn't a full embrace, not yet, but it was enough to melt something inside me. I turned away, pretending to busy myself with the kettle, hiding the tears that came uninvited. In the following months, the world moved on. The media forgot the scandal, the company was sold, and people found new names to gossip about. Ethan took a small job at a local firm, working quietly, rebuilding his reputation from scratch. David and I visited him sometimes. He looked different now, humbler, slower to speak, quicker to listen. One evening he came home with flowers for me. He said, "These are not from guilt, Mom. They are from gratitude. You never stop believing in me, even when I stop believing in myself." I smiled and said, "A mother's love doesn't run out. It just waits." As for David, something in him changed too. The bitterness that once lived behind his eyes softened. He started writing again, something he hadn't done in years. He said, "It helps me let go." I found a few pages one day when I was cleaning. It was a story about a man who built a kingdom and lost it to his son, only to realize the kingdom was never the walls he built, but the love he failed to protect. I placed the pages back without saying a word. That night when he came to bed, I whispered, "You wrote something beautiful." He smiled faintly and said, "It's just what my heart needed to say." One Sunday evening, we had dinner together like old times. No tension, no raised voices, just quiet conversation and soft laughter. Ethan told us about a project he was helping with, a charity that supported small family businesses. David listened carefully, then nodded with approval. I could see in that moment that the storm had finally passed. After dinner, we sat outside watching the sunset. The sky was painted with gold and crimson, and for the first time in a long while, I felt peace fill every corner of our lives. Later that night, I stood by the window again, looking at the reflection of our family in the glass. It wasn't perfect, it never would be, but it was real. The scars were still there, but they were no longer wounds. I whispered to myself that forgiveness does not erase the past, it just makes space for the future. I thought about the day I had seen my husband crying and my son laughing, and how that moment had broken something in me. But now, years later, I understood that pain had also taught us what love truly means. Not control, not pride, but patience, humility, and grace. David walked up behind me and placed his arm around my shoulders. He said softly, "It's over now, Maggie." I leaned into him and said, "Yes, but maybe it had to happen this way." He nodded and said, "Maybe it did." I watched our son sitting at the table, working late, his face calm under the soft light. I realized that the journey from pride to peace is long and painful, but it's worth every step. Because in the end, what remains is not what we lost, but what we learned And so I closed my eyes and whispered a silent prayer of gratitude for the pain that taught us to love better, for the silence that taught us to listen, for the betrayal that taught us the true meaning of forgiveness. Life had come full circle, not with revenge, not with victory, but with understanding. And that, I knew, was the greatest triumph of all. Years passed quietly after that storm, and the house began to carry laughter again. Not loud or careless laughter like before, but the kind that comes when people have learned what truly matters. Ethan visited often now. Sometimes he brought his wife and children, and our home would fill with the sound of tiny footsteps and innocent voices. I would sit on the porch with David, watching them play in the yard, feeling the soft wind brush against my face. There was peace in our world again, the kind that grows only after pain has done its work. David's hair had turned completely gray by then, but his eyes were calm and wise. He often said forgiveness doesn't change the past, but it changes the way you live with it. And every time he said that, I understood a little more. One day, Ethan came to visit alone. He sat with me in the kitchen, holding a cup of coffee like it carried all his thoughts. He said, "Mom, I used to think success was about power and recognition. But after losing everything, I realized success is just peace of mind." I smiled and said peace is the most expensive thing we ever earn. He looked out the window for a long time before saying, "I never thanked Dad properly." I said he knows, but it's never too late to say it anyway. That evening he found David in the garden. I watched from the window as Ethan walked up to him and said something I couldn't hear. David looked up, smiled, and pulled him into a hug. No words were needed. The past was gone, and love had taken its place again. After dinner that night, we sat together on the porch. The sky was full of stars, and the air smelled of rain. Ethan said, "Do you ever regret forgiving me?" I looked at him and said no, because forgiveness gave me back my family. David nodded quietly beside me. Then Ethan said, "I want to tell my children everything when they grow up. I want them to know how easy it is to lose your way and how hard it is to earn back trust." I smiled and said, "Tell them, but tell them with love, not with shame. Because love carries lessons better than anger ever could." When they left that night, I walked to the window again, the same one where I had once seen everything fall apart. The glass reflected my face, older now, but softer. The woman who had once cried there was gone. In her place was someone who had learned that pain is not the end of a story, only a chapter. I remembered the day I came home from that trip and saw my husband crying while my son laughed with his in-laws. That image had haunted me for years, but now, when I closed my eyes, I could replace it with a new one. My husband smiling, my son hugging him, my grandchildren running across the grass under the same sky that had once felt so dark. Sometimes life brings storms not to destroy us, but to clean the path we were afraid to walk. Forgiveness had not erased what happened, but it had given it meaning. It had turned our pain into wisdom. I realized then that revenge might feel like justice, but it leaves you empty when the anger fades. Forgiveness, on the other hand, fills you quietly, like sunlight after rain. It doesn't shout. It doesn't prove anything. It just heals. A few months later, David and I celebrated our 40th wedding anniversary. Ethan organized a small gathering in our backyard. Friends, neighbors, and family came to celebrate. There were speeches and laughter, music and toasts, but what stayed with me most was what Ethan said. He stood up, raised his glass, and said, "I once thought my father was my competition, but now I know he was my greatest teacher. And my mother, she was the strength that kept us all from breaking apart." Everyone clapped, but I couldn't hold back the tears. They weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of peace. As the night ended and people began to leave, I stood in the quiet yard under the soft glow of the garden lights. I looked at David and said, "It feels like everything has come full circle." He took my hand and said, "It always does, Maggie, as long as we choose love over bitterness." We stood there for a long while, listening to the distant sound of the city and the laughter of our grandchildren fading into the night, and that is how life found its balance again. The betrayal that once broke our hearts became the bridge that brought us closer. The silence that once filled our home became the calm we had always needed. I learned that forgiveness is not weakness. It is courage. It takes more strength to let go than to hold on. I learned that people can lose their way, but love can guide them home again. So when I look back now, I don't see the day I came home and found my husband crying while my son laughed with his in-laws. I see the day our family was reborn, the day pain turned into purpose, the day love won quietly without needing to prove anything. That is the story I carry with me, not of revenge, not of betrayal, but of grace. Because in the end, forgiveness is the greatest revenge life can ever offer.